A heartless millionaire mockingly offered a DNA test to a homeless woman who claimed to be family. The results shocked everyone. She was his twin sister, separated during a hospital evacuation decades ago. His cruel public stunt had revealed his own forgotten past and true heir to his fortune. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The midday sun beat down on the manicured lawn of Thorne Manor, a stark contrast to the chilling dampness Clara felt clinging to her threadbare clothes. Julian Thorne, a man sculpted from arrogance and tailored suits, stood on the expansive patio, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He gestured with a diamond-encrusted hand towards a table laden with sterile medical supplies. The hushed whispers of the assembled press formed a dissonant symphony to the birdsong. "Well, Clara," Julian sneered, his voice amplified by a microphone. "Let's settle this once and for all. Are you really my long-lost sister? Or just another leech trying to exploit my fortune?" His words, barbed and cruel, hung heavy in the air, laced with a disdain that made Clara's stomach churn. Clara, her gaze fixed on the DNA swab, felt a tremor of fear mingle with a flicker of desperate hope. Years of living on the streets had hardened her, yet the possibility, however slim, of escaping this harsh reality ignited a fragile ember of longing within her. She swallowed, her throat dry, and nodded silently, her gaze unwavering. The air thrummed with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the erratic beat of her own heart. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes that betrayed years of witnessing human suffering, gently guided Clara through the procedure. The swab, cold against Clara's cheek, seemed to carry the weight of decades of unanswered questions. Julian watched, his expression a mask of cold calculation, betraying nothing of the turmoil brewing within. The waiting was the worst. Each second stretched into an eternity, the silence amplifying the tension in the air. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the pristine lawn, a metaphor for the darkening uncertainty in Clara's heart. Finally, the nurse returned, a single sheet of paper clutched in her hand. The words on it were stark, unambiguous, match confirmed. The air hung heavy with the weight of the confirmation. The crisp white paper, stark against the nurse's pale hands, felt like a verdict. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic drumming of Clara's heart. Julian, his face a carefully constructed mask of composure, remained motionless, his eyes betraying nothing. Yet, the slight tremor in his hand, as he reached for the results, hinted at a storm brewing beneath the surface. Clara felt a dizzying rush. Hope, fragile and tentative, bloomed in her chest, pushing back against years of hardened cynicism. It felt surreal, like a dream from which she would soon awaken, back to the harsh reality of her life on the streets. But the paper, the undeniable words, the solemn face of the nurse, all grounded her in this impossible truth. "Well," Julian's voice, though carefully controlled, cracked slightly. The arrogance was still there, a thin veneer over something else. Fear? Uncertainty? Clara couldn't speak. The words caught in her throat, a lump of disbelief and awe. She simply nodded, her eyes welling, tears tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. The sun, dipping below the horizon, cast long shadows, highlighting the stark contrast between the opulent Thorne Manor and her threadbare clothing. The scent of manicured lawns and expensive flowers clashed harshly with the lingering smell of damp earth and stale cigarettes clinging to her clothes. The nurse, her eyes filled with a quiet compassion, gently placed a hand on Clara's arm. "It's quite remarkable," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the nearby trees. The whisper felt like a confirmation of Clara's own dawning reality. This wasn't a cruel joke. This was her life, irrevocably changed. The weight of decades of separation, of lost time and missed opportunities, pressed down on her. But beneath that, a new feeling stirred. A spark of hope, a fragile but persistent ember of possibility. The future remained unwritten, a blank page filled with terrifying unknowns and unexpected opportunities. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt she might have a chance to write her own story. The revelation hung in the air, a seismic shift, altering the landscape of their lives forever. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the implications of the DNA test settled upon them. Julian, his carefully crafted composure cracking, ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. The scent of expensive cologne, usually a shield, now felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the earthy smell clinging to Clara. He cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly brittle. "So," he began, his voice a low rumble, "this changes things." Clara, her eyes still brimming, found her voice, surprisingly steady. "It changes everything," she whispered, the words catching on the ragged edge of a lifetime's hardship. The opulent surroundings of Thorn Manor, with its gleaming marble floors and hushed grandeur, felt utterly alien, a world away from the grimy alleyways she called home. Yet, a strange sense of belonging, tentative and fragile, began to bloom within her. The nurse, a woman whose face held the etched wisdom of years spent witnessing life's unpredictable turns, offered a gentle smile. "Perhaps," she suggested softly, her voice laced with a quiet understanding, "it's time to unpack some memories." That night, under the soft glow of a bedside lamp in a guest room that dwarfed her entire former existence, Clara found herself staring at a faded photograph Julian had unearthed from a dusty attic trunk. It depicted two toddlers, identical in their cherubic features, playing in a sun-drenched garden. The scene, vibrant despite its age, felt both familiar and foreign, a ghost of a memory surfacing from a deep, submerged part of her consciousness. A wave of emotion, a mixture of joy, sorrow, and a profound sense of loss washed over her. Julian, watching from the doorway, saw the tears stream down her face. He didn't approach, he couldn't. The wall he'd built around his heart, brick by painful brick, was crumbling. He felt a prickle of something unfamiliar, a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, a bitter counterpoint to the unsettling sense of discovery blooming within him. "That's us," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. He knew he should offer some kind of explanation, some apology, but the words seemed to catch in his throat, choked by a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. Clara looked up, her gaze meeting his. The coldness that had previously defined him had softened, replaced by a flicker of something akin to remorse. Hope, that delicate seedling planted by the DNA test results, grew a little taller. This was just the beginning. The road ahead remained uncertain, fraught with complexities and potential conflicts. But for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. The future, once a bleak and desolate landscape, suddenly shimmered with the possibility of a new dawn. The antique clock in the hallway chimed, each toll a heavy hammer blow against Julian's fragile composure. He paced, the polished mahogany floor cold beneath his bare feet, the scent of old wood and dust a stark contrast to the sterile hospital smell clinging to Clara's worn jacket. He'd offered her a room, a gesture as clumsy as it was unprecedented, and now watched her from the doorway, a captive audience to her silent grief. The faded photograph lay open on the antique writing desk, its vibrant colors mocking the monochrome pallor of her face. Clara traced the outline of the children in the photograph, her fingertip lingering on their identical smiles. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her weathered cheek, a testament to years of hardship, of dreams deferred, of a life lived on the margins. The memory, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered at the edge of her consciousness. A sun-drenched garden, the laughter of children, a sudden, jarring sound, a siren's wail. The image dissolved, leaving behind a painful void. "It's blurry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words lost in the vast emptiness of the grand room. The silence felt suffocating, amplifying the unspoken questions hanging between them. Julian cleared his throat, the sound harsh and unfamiliar even to his own ears. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but the ingrained habit of detachment held him back. "The hospital records, they're incomplete," he offered, his voice rough with a raw emotion he didn't understand. The evacuation chaos. Babies were separated. He watched her, searching her face for any sign of understanding, of anger, of anything besides the quiet devastation that consumed her. He saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a fragile spark of connection amidst the wreckage of her life. The guilt, a constant companion for years, intensified, a heavy weight on his chest. The life he had meticulously constructed, a fortress of wealth and indifference, was crumbling before his eyes. The sterile opulence of Thorn Manor felt like a prison, the silence a mocking chorus of his past cruelty. He needed to atone, to make amends. He just didn't know how, like a lifeline in the tumultuous sea of their shared past. The battle for her inheritance had begun, but for the first time it didn't feel like a fight for money, but a fight for family. A fight for a truth both beautiful and terrifying. The sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating them, casting long shadows that seemed to merge, two figures silhouetted against the backdrop of their shared destiny. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Clara's memory, a phantom smell overlaying the rich aroma of Julian's study. He'd brought her here, to his opulent world, a world so alien to the grimy alleyways she called home. The lawyer's accusations still echoed, a discordant symphony against the ticking grandfather clock. Julian watched her, a storm brewing in his usually icy blue eyes, mirroring the tempest within her. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced her cautious optimism. "They'll say I manipulated you," Julian said, his voice low, a stark contrast to the lawyer's bluster. The words were a confession, a crack in his carefully constructed wall of indifference. Clara met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting a flicker of the same fear. "And maybe they're right," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Maybe I wanted to believe." He sat beside her, the plush velvet sinking beneath his weight. The distance between them, once vast and insurmountable, felt suddenly fragile. He saw the tremor in her hand, the same hand that had once held a tattered shopping bag, now resting on the edge of a mahogany desk. "But that doesn't change the truth," Julian insisted, his voice softening. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, seeking reassurance as much as offering it. The touch, gentle but firm, brought a wave of warmth, unexpected and disarming. "The truth is messy," Clara replied, her voice barely a breath. She looked at their intertwined hands, a stark contrast of rough and smooth, calloused and soft. "It's a hospital, a fire, a frantic escape." Her voice trailed off, a cascade of fragmented memories. The image of a blazing building, the screams, the chaos, the separation. A shared silence descended, thick with the weight of unspoken emotions. The ticking clock seemed to amplify the silence, each tick a reminder of the lost time, the stolen years. Julian squeezed her hand, a silent promise, a shared acknowledgement of the turbulent journey ahead. The battle for her inheritance was a legal fight, but it was also a fight for their shared past, a fight for the fragile bond that was beginning to form between them. The battle had begun, but this time they wouldn't fight alone. The mahogany desk gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the lawyer's office, a stark contrast to the worn, cracked leather of Clara's handbag. Julian watched her, his usually impenetrable facade crumbling. The lawyer's words, sharp and accusatory, hung in the air, thick with suspicion. He saw the tremor in her hand as she clutched her bag, a lifeline to her past, a stark reminder of the life she'd left behind. "They'll paint you as a gold digger," the lawyer had hissed, his voice dripping with cynicism. The accusation hung heavy, a palpable weight in the room. Clara swallowed, her Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The scent of old paper and expensive cologne battled the lingering smell of antiseptic that clung to her like a second skin. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide, mirroring his own turmoil. Years of hardship had etched lines onto her face, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakably fresh. "I don't care what they say," Julian said, his voice low and gravelly, a sound so unlike his usual clipped tones that it startled Clara. He reached across the desk, his hand hovering over hers before settling on the worn leather of her bag. The touch was brief, but the warmth it conveyed was undeniable. "It's not about the money," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "It's about—" He paused, searching for the right words, his usual eloquence deserting him. "It's about finding my sister." The admission hung in the air, a fragile thing, easily shattered. Clara's gaze softened. The years of loneliness, of suspicion, of harsh realities, seemed to melt away for a moment. She saw something in his eyes, vulnerability, guilt, maybe even a hint of remorse. It was a glimpse into a part of him she'd never seen before, a part hidden beneath layers of arrogance and indifference. I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock. She squeezed the worn leather of her bag, a familiar comfort in the face of unfamiliar emotions. "I know it's not just about the money." The lawyer's skeptical gaze remained fixed upon them, a constant reminder of the legal battle ahead. But for a brief moment, suspended between accusations and anxieties, Julian and Clara found solace in their shared, unexpected connection. The truth, as messy and complicated as it was beginning to take root. The fight for the inheritance was just beginning, but the fight for their family, for their shared past, had already begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Clara's clothes, a stark contrast to the opulent floral perfume that hung heavy in the air of Julian's penthouse suite. He'd offered her a room, a gesture that felt both generous and strangely manipulative. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden rays. It was a world away from the grimy alleys she called home. This is incredible," Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The view stretched across the city, a breathtaking panorama of glittering skyscrapers and bustling streets. It was a world she'd only ever glimpsed from afar, a world that now, impossibly, felt partially hers. Julian watched her, his expression unreadable. The arrogance that had once been so pervasive was softened, replaced by a hesitant vulnerability that both intrigued and unsettled Clara. He'd spent the last few days buried in old photographs, hospital records, anything that might shed light on their shared past. The weight of his actions, the callous disregard he'd shown, pressed down on him. I am sorry," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken apologies for years of cruelty and indifference. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the cityscape, a stark reflection of his own fractured soul. Clara took a step closer. "For what?" she asked, her voice soft, laced with a hesitant hope. She wasn't entirely sure she could trust him, yet the years of loneliness had left her yearning for connection, for family. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "For everything. For the way I treated you. For the way I ignored the possibility." He ran a hand through his hair, his usually impeccable composure shattered. The years of carefully constructed privilege felt like a fragile mask, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken emotions. The city lights twinkled outside, a silent witness to their fragile reconciliation. The scent of lilies from a nearby vase mingled with the lingering antiseptic, a strange, poignant blend of the past and present. Clara reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. It was a small gesture, but it held the weight of decades of separation, of years of unspoken longing. The touch was a tentative bridge, a fragile connection built on the unsteady foundations of shared DNA and unexpected kinship. The fight for the inheritance was far from over, but in this moment, amidst the luxury and the lingering scent of antiseptic, a tentative hope bloomed. The battle for their family had begun, and for the first time, the odds felt a little less daunting. The lawyer's words hung heavy in the air, each syllable a hammer blow against Julian's meticulously constructed world. He felt the polished mahogany of his desk grow slick beneath his clammy palms. "The DNA evidence is irrefutable, Mr. Thorne. Miss Clara Dubois is your twin sister." The sterile scent of the lawyer's office clashed violently with the lingering scent of expensive cologne clinging to Julian's clothes. He closed his eyes, the city lights outside blurring into indistinct streaks of color. Guilt, raw and visceral, clawed at him. Clara, seated across from him, remained unervingly calm, her gaze steady, reflecting the city's hard edges. The stark contrast between her worn clothes and the opulent surroundings felt like a physical weight in the room. Years of hardship had etched lines around her eyes, a stark counterpoint to Julian's carefully preserved youth. He had seen them mirrored in old photographs. Identical eyes, the same stubborn set to their jawline. "What now?" Julian asked, his voice a mere rasp. The question hung in the suffocating silence, thick with unspoken anxieties. He looked at Clara, a stranger who was, terrifyingly, his mirror image. Clara shifted, a slight tremor in her hands betraying her composure. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. She looked away, her eyes falling on a small, faded photograph on the lawyer's desk. A picture of a young couple, their faces blurred with time, but the resemblance unmistakable. Their parents. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through Julian's carefully constructed defenses. The chaos of the hospital evacuation, the screaming, the frantic search, the agonizing loss. He remembered the scent of smoke and fear, a primal terror he'd buried deep within himself for decades. He'd built a wall around his past, brick by carefully crafted lie upon lie, but it was crumbling now, pulverized by the undeniable truth. His carefully constructed identity was a house of cards, collapsing before his eyes. The lawyer cleared his throat, offering a seemingly insignificant detail that suddenly felt monumental. "There's a nurse, Ms. Evelyn Reed, who worked at the hospital during the evacuation. She may have further information." Hope, fragile but potent, flickered in Clara's eyes. It was a flicker mirrored in Julian's own soul, a tiny spark amidst the ashes of his carefully constructed life. The battle for his fortune was only one aspect of this shattering revelation. A far greater battle was brewing, a battle for understanding, for forgiveness, for the reclamation of a lost family. The fight had begun, but this time it was a fight for something far more precious than wealth. The lawyer's nameplate, stark and impersonal, seemed to mock Julian's opulent surroundings. He felt the cool, smooth surface of his mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the burning shame within. Clara sat opposite, a ghost of his own reflection, her eyes mirroring the city's relentless gray. The shared past, unearthed so brutally, hung between them, thick and suffocating. "Evelyn Reed, I remember that name," Julian muttered, his voice roughened by disuse. The memory, faint at first, sharpened. A kind face, hurried movements, the overwhelming scent of antiseptic and fear. Clara's fingers traced a pattern on the worn fabric of her skirt, her knuckles white. "If she's still alive, maybe she can tell us what happened." A thread of hope, fragile as spun glass, shone in her eyes. He watched her, this woman he'd treated with such callous disregard, and a wave of nausea washed over him. The weight of his actions pressed down, crushing him under the burden of his own cruelty. This wasn't about money. It was about a life stolen, a sister lost, a past brutally suppressed. I'll find her," he said, the words a testament to a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. The lawyer, sensing a shift in the dynamic, offered a sympathetic nod. "I have her contact information," he said quietly. "She's retired, living just outside the city." The city outside was a blur of harsh angles and neon lights, but the image in his mind's eye was of a small, sun-drenched cottage, a place where a nurse, long retired, might hold the key to unlocking a shared past, buried deep beneath decades of silence and regret. The journey to find Evelyn Reed was a journey into the heart of his own self-destruction, and for the first time, Julian felt ready to face it. The battle for his inheritance paled in comparison to the fight for his soul. The lawyer's office, cool and sterile, felt miles away from the sun-drenched cottage Julian envisioned. He pictured Evelyn Reed, her face a blur of faded memory, but the scent of antiseptic remained sharp, a phantom limb of his past. Clara, quiet beside him, fidgeted with the worn hem of her borrowed skirt, the fabric a stark contrast to the plush carpet beneath. The silence, thick with unspoken emotions, was almost unbearable. "Do you remember anything else?" Julian asked, his voice a low rumble, hesitant and uncertain. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. The ice clinked softly, the sound amplified in the hushed room. Clara shook her head, her gaze distant, lost in the labyrinth of her own memories. Fragments, flashes of light, of noise, a rush of people, the smell of smoke, then nothing. Her voice was barely a whisper, each word a precious shard of a shattered past. Tears welled in her eyes, reflecting the muted light filtering through the tall windows. Julian watched her, his own heart heavy with a guilt he hadn't known he could feel. The callous millionaire he once was seemed a distant, grotesque caricature. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about piecing together a life, a connection that had been brutally severed. He saw the fear in her eyes, the deep-seated mistrust, years of hardship etched onto her face. "We'll find answers," he said, his voice firmer now, a promise both to her and to himself. He felt a surge of determination, a newfound strength born from shared trauma and the dawning realization of his own humanity. The battle for his inheritance now felt insignificant, overshadowed by the far greater battle for their shared past, and for the fragile bond beginning to form between them. The lawyer's quiet presence, previously a stark reminder of the legal battle ahead, now felt like a silent witness to the burgeoning reconciliation. The journey to Evelyn Reed's cottage was not just a search for answers, but a pilgrimage to the heart of his own redemption. He squeezed Clara's hand, a small gesture filled with an unexpected tenderness. The touch sent a jolt through her, a flicker of warmth in the chilling landscape of her past. The city lights, once symbols of his detached opulence, now reflected a shared future, uncertain yet brimming with the possibility of forgiveness. The court hearing was a blur of hushed whispers and legal jargon. Julian, surprisingly, felt a sense of calm amidst the storm. The opulent mahogany table, usually a symbol of his power, felt strangely insignificant. Clara, seated beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his, was the anchor in this chaotic sea. Her eyes, usually clouded with fear and mistrust, held a spark of defiance. The lawyer's voice droned on, outlining the intricacies of inheritance laws, but Julian only saw Clara. He saw the resilience etched onto her face, the quiet strength that had carried her through years of hardship. He saw the woman he'd so cruelly dismissed, now standing beside him, a testament to the unexpected twists of fate and the awakening of his own conscience. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack that sliced through the tension. The ruling was in their favor. A wave of relief washed over Julian, so profound it surprised him. It wasn't just the preservation of his fortune. It was the validation of Clara's rightful place in his life. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. Later, they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights twinkling like a million fallen stars. The cold night air whipped at their faces, but the chill was insignificant compared to the warmth blossoming between them. "It's over," Clara whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time, they weren't tears of despair. Julian pulled her close, enveloping her in a hug that spoke volumes of unspoken apologies and burgeoning affection. He felt the tremor of her body, the raw vulnerability that he'd been so blind to before. "It's just the beginning," he murmured, his voice husky with emotion. He inhaled the scent of her hair, a subtle mix of rain and resilience, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes that once filled his world. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in the unexpected connections that could mend a shattered past. The city lights shimmered, reflecting the newfound hope dawning in their eyes. A shared future, brighter and more meaningful than either could have imagined. The callous millionaire was gone, replaced by a man finally learning the true meaning of family. The penthouse suite felt vast and empty, despite Clara's presence. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the grime she'd known for so long. Julian watched her, a quiet observer. She sat on the plush cream sofa, fingers tracing the intricate pattern of the fabric, a far cry from the rough texture of cardboard. A hesitant smile played on her lips as she examined a framed photo, a faded image of a young boy and girl, their faces blurred but undeniably similar to her own and Julian's. "They look like us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's low hum. Julian nodded, the word catching in his throat. He'd spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, but those walls were crumbling. The court's decision had been more than a legal victory. It was a crack in his carefully constructed facade. "They were happy," Clara added, her gaze distant, lost in the past. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. Julian crossed the room, the polished marble floor cool beneath his feet. He knelt beside her, the gesture unexpected, even to himself. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. The words, so simple yet so profound, held the weight of decades of neglect and cruelty. "For what?" Clara asked, her voice soft, but her eyes held a lingering suspicion. "For everything," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "For the test, for the way I treated you, for stealing your life." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. The touch was tentative, hesitant, seeking permission. Clara didn't pull away. She slowly placed her hand in his. It was a gesture of trust, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their past. The warmth of her skin against his was a revelation, a profound sense of connection he'd never known. The city lights outside shimmered, reflecting the dawning hope in their eyes. The battle was won, but the journey of healing had just begun. The penthouse, once a symbol of isolation, was slowly transforming into a sanctuary, a shared space where a fractured past could be pieced together, one hesitant step at a time. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered conversations and rustling papers. Clara, perched on the edge of her seat, felt the plush fabric dig into her thighs, a stark contrast to the rough benches of her past. The air hung thick with anticipation, the scent of expensive perfume battling the faint smell of old wood and legal documents. Julian, beside her, looked paler than usual, his usual arrogance replaced by a nervous fidgeting. He hadn't spoken much since the judge's gavel fell, the silence a heavy weight between them. The lawyer's voice, sharp and precise, dissected the legal arguments, each word a carefully placed brick in the wall of their defense. Clara barely heard him. Her gaze drifted to the stained glass window high above, its colors a kaleidoscope of swirling emotions. A single tear escaped, unnoticed amidst the sea of faces. She wiped it away quickly, ashamed of her vulnerability in this opulent setting. This wasn't the life she knew. This wasn't the life she ever expected. Julian squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture so small, yet so meaningful. The simple touch sent a ripple of warmth through her, a jolt of recognition that transcended the awkwardness of their newfound siblinghood. This man, who'd once treated her like dirt, now offered silent support. The judge's voice cut through the tension. In light of the overwhelming DNA evidence and the corroborating testimony, the court rules in favor of Ms. Clara Thorne. Ms. Thorne is legally recognized as an heir to the Thorne estate. A wave of relief washed over Clara, so potent it almost knocked her off her feet. She looked at Julian, expecting triumph, yet his face remained etched with a profound sadness. He wasn't celebrating. He was mourning a life he'd once cherished, a life built on lies and denial. The victory felt bittersweet, tainted by the weight of their shared past. Later, in the quiet solitude of his penthouse, the city lights a shimmering backdrop to their fragile peace, Julian finally broke his silence. I never meant for any of this to happen," he confessed, his voice raw with regret. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her, seeing not a homeless woman, but a sister, a reflection of himself, lost and found. He saw the lingering shadows of hardship in her eyes, the resilience that had carried her through years of adversity. I was a fool," he whispered, the confession hanging heavy in the air. Clara met his gaze, understanding finally dawning. The road ahead was long, but for the first time they walked it together. The penthouse suite felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Crystal chandeliers cast a cold light on Julian, his face etched with a weariness that belied his expensive suit. Clara, perched on a plush velvet chair that swallowed her small frame, nervously fingered the delicate rim of a champagne flute, the bubbly liquid untouched. The city lights, a glittering tapestry below, offered no comfort. I don't know how to do this," Julian finally admitted, his voice a low rumble that barely carried across the vast expanse of the room. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. Clara met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the shimmering city below, yet mirroring the tempest in his own soul. Years of hardship had hardened her, but the raw emotion emanating from him softened the edges of her defenses. "Do what, Julian?" she asked, her voice soft, laced with a cautious empathy. He looked away, staring out at the cityscape, the vast expanse somehow reflecting the chasm between them. Be a brother. I've never known how." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with regret. A silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city. Clara understood his struggle. The sudden influx of family, of shared history, was as alien to her as his opulent lifestyle had once seemed. Yet, she also saw a flicker of something new in his eyes: vulnerability, regret, a yearning for connection that resonated deeply within her. "It's okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We can learn." She took a tentative sip of champagne, the bubbles a surprising comfort on her tongue. "We have time." Julian turned to her, his gaze intense, searching. He saw not the homeless woman he'd so cruelly judged, but a kindred spirit, scarred yet resilient, a reflection of his own hidden wounds. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Time," he repeated, the word a promise. A fragile hope blooming in the heart of a man who'd built his life on denial. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor, a sudden, sharp sound cutting through the fragile peace they'd managed to forge. The shards mirrored the fractured pieces of their lives, pieces they now had the long and challenging task of painstakingly putting back together. But in that shared silence, amidst the scattered glass, a new beginning felt possible. The media frenzy was a maelstrom. Headlines screamed of "Millionaire's secret twin" and "Homeless woman inherits fortune." The penthouse, once a sanctuary of quiet luxury, was now besieged by flashing cameras and insistent reporters. Julian, pale and drawn, felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He'd underestimated the public's appetite for scandal. Clara, surprisingly, seemed less affected by the chaos. She was shielded, somehow, by a quiet strength Julian hadn't known she possessed. He found her on the balcony, gazing at the city lights, a stark contrast to the pandemonium inside. The cool night air whipped strands of her dark hair around her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones. He joined her, the silence between them a fragile truce amidst the storm. "They're relentless," he muttered, his voice tight with exhaustion. Clara nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Like vultures," she added, a hint of bitterness lacing her tone. But there was also something else, a resilience forged in the fires of adversity. Julian watched her, a strange mix of guilt and admiration swirling within him. He'd offered the DNA test as a cruel joke. Now, he was facing the consequences not just legal battles, but the shattering of his carefully constructed reality. He'd lived a life devoid of genuine human connection, a life of superficial relationships and calculated moves. Now, faced with a real connection, he stumbled. I'm sorry," he began, the words catching in his throat. The apology felt inadequate, a feeble attempt to atone for years of callous disregard. Clara turned to him, her eyes, usually shadowed with weariness, now held a flicker of understanding. "For what, Julian?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of shared experience. The city lights twinkled behind her, painting her face in a soft, ethereal glow. "For everything," he whispered. The admission a heavy weight lifted from his chest. The weight of his past actions, of his arrogance, of his deliberate cruelty. The city lights, usually a symbol of his power and success, felt suffocating now. He shifted his weight, his expensive suit feeling suddenly uncomfortable, foreign. The cool night air provided a strange comfort. "For making a mockery of your life. For not seeing you." He reached out a hand, hesitantly, as if afraid to break the fragile connection forming between them. Clara met his gaze, and for a moment, the chaos of the world faded, leaving only the two of them, brother and sister, bound by a shared past and a precarious future. The champagne flute incident felt far away, a broken shard of a life they were both determined to rebuild. The city lights seemed to hold their breath, waiting with them. The penthouse suite, usually a haven of polished marble and minimalist design, felt claustrophobic. The air hung thick with the scent of expensive perfume and simmering tension. Lawyers, their faces etched with professional concern, paced like caged animals. Julian, surrounded by the sterile calm of his meticulously ordered life, felt anything but calm. He watched Clara, perched on a plush velvet armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The expensive fabric seemed to swallow her whole, a stark contrast to the threadbare clothes she'd worn only days ago. "They're contesting the will," his lawyer, Mr. Finch, announced, his voice a low hum against the background murmur of hushed conversations. Julian felt a familiar icy grip of panic tighten around his chest. He hadn't anticipated this level of resistance. His carefully constructed empire, built on ruthlessness and indifference, was crumbling around him. Clara met his gaze, her eyes, usually filled with a quiet weariness, now held a spark of defiance. "They say I'm not really family," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet somehow cutting through the lawyerly jargon. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Was this about money, or was it something more insidious, a deeper-seated rejection of her sudden intrusion into his meticulously controlled world? Julian felt a pang of something akin to guilt. He'd thought this would be a simple matter, a legal formality. He hadn't anticipated the emotional fallout, the visceral reaction to the revelation of his hidden twin. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some reassurance, some promise of protection, but the words caught in his throat. Years of suppressing emotion had left him tongue-tied, incapable of expressing the complex mix of guilt, fear, and a nascent sense of responsibility he felt towards Clara. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. He watched as Clara rose, her silhouette framed against the panoramic city view. The city, a symbol of his wealth and power, now felt less like a conquest and more like a cold, unforgiving landscape. He felt a pull towards her, a desperate need to bridge the chasm that separated them, to somehow atone for the decades of indifference that had kept them apart. The cool night air from the open balcony promised a respite from the suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse. He wanted to join her, to offer something more substantial than a mumbled apology, but the fear of rejection, of further exposure, kept him rooted to the spot. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotions, as the future of his legacy and, more importantly, his relationship with his newfound sister hung precariously in the balance. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of anticipation. Sunlight, slanted through the tall windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, each a tiny, shimmering testament to the passage of time and time Julian had wasted, time Clara had endured. He watched her, a stark figure in a simple navy dress, a world away from the opulent surroundings. Her lawyer, a formidable woman with steely eyes and a voice like polished steel, was laying out their case. The air crackled with the unspoken tension between Julian and Clara. A silent battle waged across the polished mahogany of the judge's bench. "Mr. Thorne," the judge's voice, crisp and impartial, cut through the tension. Do you concede to Ms. Moreau's claim? Julian swallowed, the dryness in his throat a physical manifestation of his anxiety. He glanced at Clara, her face pale but resolute. The years of hardship etched lines around her eyes, but there was a newfound strength in her posture, a dignity he hadn't seen before. He'd spent years building his empire on calculated risk, on the cold, hard logic of finance. But this was different. This wasn't about assets or liabilities. It was about something far more profound, something he hadn't understood until now: family. I do, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like a betrayal, a surrender of the carefully constructed life he'd built. Yet, in that surrender, he felt a strange release. The weight on his chest, the burden of his past actions, eased slightly. Clara didn't react outwardly, her expression remaining carefully neutral. Julian's vulnerability. Clara's eyes, usually bright with a resilient spirit, were clouded with fear. The scent of old paper and antiseptic hung heavy, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air they'd breathed just moments before. Julian squeezed her hand tighter, a silent affirmation of his unwavering support. He could feel the tremor in her hand, mirroring the turmoil in his own chest. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden he'd never fully acknowledged until now. Your client's claim is based on circumstantial evidence, Finch sneered, his gaze cold and calculating. A flimsy connection, easily manipulated. The words hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Julian felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce loyalty towards Clara that surprised him with its intensity. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend her, but Ms. Davies raised a hand, silencing him with a subtle gesture. He saw the faintest flicker of anger in Clara's eyes, quickly masked by a controlled composure that belied her fear. A photograph, the same faded image from the hallway, was displayed on a screen. The two infants, swaddled in identical blankets, stared back at the courtroom, their tiny faces almost identical. The image resonated with a profound sadness, a stark visual representation of their shared, stolen past. The courtroom fell silent. Even Finch seemed momentarily taken aback by the power of the image. The recess was called again. This time, it was a different kind of silence. Not the tense, anticipatory silence of the previous break, but a pregnant, heavy silence filled with unspoken emotions. Julian led Clara outside, the crisp air a welcome balm against the oppressive atmosphere within. He saw a tear escape her eye, a single silent drop that mirrored the storm raging within him. He couldn't undo the past, but he could fight for her future. He would fight for his sister, for his family. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, the hope he'd felt earlier bloomed into something stronger, something akin to unwavering resolve. The recess felt like an eternity. The stale air of the courtroom clung to Clara like a second skin, a stark contrast to the autumn breeze whispering through the trees outside. Julian watched her, her usually vibrant spirit dimmed by fear. He saw the tremor in her hand, a silent plea he couldn't ignore. He squeezed it gently, a small act of defiance against the cold indifference of the legal battle. "They're trying to break you, Clara," he murmured, his voice low and steady, meant only for her ears. She looked up, her eyes mirroring the storm raging within him. "I won't let them," she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the hushed murmur of the hallway. The scent of old polish and dust filled the air. "They can't take this from you," he said, his gaze unwavering. This is your life now, too." He saw a flicker of something, hope, resilience, in her eyes. It was a fragile thing, easily extinguished, but it was there. The return to the courtroom was a descent back into the icy grip of the legal battle. Mr. Finch, relentless as a shark circling its prey, continued his attack. But this time something had shifted. The photograph, that stark visual testament to their shared past, had planted a seed of doubt. Ms. Davies, shrewd and precise, expertly countered Finch's accusations, weaving a narrative of fractured memories and a cruel twist of fate. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing breathing in the silence between words, the rustling of papers, the rhythmic tapping of a pen. Julian, watching Clara, saw her fear slowly transform into a quiet determination. She was no longer just a homeless woman. She was a sister, a fighter, an heir to a fortune unjustly withheld. The judge, finally, called for a brief adjournment. The weight of the day pressed down on them, leaving a residue of exhaustion and uncertainty. Stepping outside, Julian and Clara walked in silence for a few moments. The crisp autumn air a welcome contrast to the heavy atmosphere inside. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the world in hues of orange and gold. "Thank you, Julian," Clara said, her voice soft, almost a breath. The simple words held a weight of gratitude that surpassed any verbal expression. He looked at her, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and a burgeoning sense of responsibility. He'd started this with cruelty, but he would end it with a different kind of resolve, one born of love and understanding. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a fight for family, for redemption, for a future they could build together. The adjournment stretched into a tense, agonizing hour. The scent of stale coffee and anxiety hung heavy in the air of the courthouse cafeteria. Clara, usually quick with a wry smile, sat hunched over a lukewarm cup, her fingers tracing patterns on the condensation. Julian, observing her from across a small table, felt a familiar pang of guilt sharpen into something akin to remorse. He pushed his untouched sandwich aside. His appetite had vanished along with his usual arrogance. "They're relentless," Clara finally murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, more to herself than to him. The tremor in her hands betrayed the carefully constructed mask of composure. Julian reached across the table, his touch hesitant but gentle, covering her hand with his. "I know," he said, his voice low and soothing. The warmth of his hand was a stark contrast to the chill in the air, the biting wind whistling outside the cafe window. He saw a tear escape and trace a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail. "It's not just about the money, is it?" he asked softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw the years of hardship etched onto her face, the lines of resilience and despair intertwined like stubborn vines. She shook her head, her gaze distant, lost in a memory he couldn't see. "It's about being seen," she finally whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "About proving I exist, that I wasn't just forgotten." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of a lifetime of separation and neglect. The clatter of cutlery and hushed conversations faded into the background, leaving only the gentle drumming of rain against the window panes. Julian felt a profound sadness, a deep ache in his chest. He'd spent his life surrounded by luxury, yet he'd never felt this acutely human connection. "You exist, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He squeezed her hand gently. "And I'm sorry for everything." The words were raw, unpolished, a stark departure from his usual calculated pronouncements. He saw a flicker of surprise, then something akin to forgiveness, in her eyes. The rain intensified, mirroring the storm of emotions raging within them. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a fragile hope blossomed. The legal battle was far from over, but in that small, damp cafeteria, a bond was being forged. One forged not in the gilded cages of wealth, but in the shared crucible of pain and the yearning for acceptance. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, the possibility of a shared future felt not only possible, but profoundly desirable. The courtroom was a stifling box of polished wood and hushed whispers. Sunlight, fractured by the tall Gothic windows, cast long shadows across the polished floor. Clara, in a borrowed, slightly too large suit, felt the weight of every eye upon her. Julian, beside her, his tailored suit suddenly looking ill-fitting, felt the familiar clammy grip of anxiety. He'd rehearsed his apology countless times, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. The opposing lawyer, a sleek shark in a charcoal suit, launched into a scathing attack, questioning Clara's credibility, her past. Each word was a tiny jab, aimed to puncture her fragile hope. Clara, though, met his gaze unflinchingly. The years of battling for survival had hardened her, given her an inner strength that surprised even herself. A low murmur rippled through the gallery as a previously unseen piece of evidence was presented, a faded photograph, unearthed from the hospital archives. It showed a young nurse cradling two tiny infants, identical except for their tiny hospital bracelets. A wave of recognition washed over Julian, a visceral jolt of memory, bittersweet and painful. He'd blocked it out, buried it under layers of wealth and self-deception. Now it was a brutal excavation of his past, the truth laid bare for all to see. "This photograph," the lawyer boomed, his voice echoing in the silent court, "proves conclusively that Miss Thorne is, indeed, Mr. Thorne's twin sister." Clara's gaze flickered towards Julian, a question, a plea for understanding, in her eyes. He reached across the narrow gaps separating them, his hand covering hers, the touch solid, unwavering. It was a silent vow, a promise of protection, of unwavering support. His hand was calloused, not from work, but from years of ignoring the rough edges of his own soul. The judge's gavel fell, sharp and decisive. The verdict was clear, undeniable. The weight of years lifted from Clara's shoulders, leaving a fragile feeling of triumph mixed with a lingering sense of loss. The court adjourned to a cacophony of sound, a wave of relief crashing over Julian, a tsunami of emotion washing away years of carefully constructed barriers. Outside, the sun blazed, casting a warm golden light on the newly freed siblings. The air felt fresh, vibrant, cleansed. The legal battle was won, but a far more profound journey had just begun. A journey towards healing, towards forgiveness, towards a future where family wasn't a cruel joke, but a sanctuary. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it shimmered with the possibility of hope. The celebratory champagne tasted like ash in Julian's mouth. The legal victory felt hollow, a gilded cage still confining him. He watched Clara, radiant yet fragile, across the bustling restaurant. The expensive meal, a peace offering, sat untouched before her. "It's a lot," she finally whispered, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in her glass. The city lights blurred through the window, mirroring the turmoil in her eyes. Julian reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. "I know, but it's yours. Everything." His voice was rough, the carefully constructed facade of his millionaire persona cracking under the weight of his guilt. Clara met his gaze, a flicker of something akin to understanding softening her apprehension. I don't know how to be rich, Julian." The words were laced with a weariness that spoke volumes of her past struggles. He squeezed her hand, a silent apology. "We'll learn together. We can build something real this time." The sincerity of his words, the raw vulnerability in his tone, surprised even himself. For the first time, he felt a genuine connection with his sister, a bond stronger than shared DNA. The weight of his past actions settled on him, the cruel public spectacle, the callous disregard. He yearned to undo the damage, to mend the broken pieces of their fractured relationship. He shifted uncomfortably under the weight of guilt, the expensive suit feeling as stifling as the courtroom had been. There's so much I need to tell you," he began, his voice strained. He felt the need to confess everything. The pain, the regret that had choked him silently for so long. About everything. Clara nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, the city lights reflecting a cascade of unshed tears in her eyes. A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, the unspoken apologies and the silent promise of a shared future. A future they would build together, brick by painful brick. The champagne remained untouched, a symbol of the difficult journey ahead, but also a fragile symbol of hope, of a new beginning. The future was unwritten, uncertain yet laced with the potent possibility of forgiveness. The restaurant buzzed with a low hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, a counterpoint to the city's vibrant pulse visible through the panoramic windows. Clara's untouched plate mirrored the untouched champagne flute, a stark contrast to the opulent setting. The weight of Julian's wealth pressed down on her, a tangible burden she hadn't anticipated. She felt the scrutiny of other diners, their whispers a subtle reminder of her sudden elevation from the streets. Julian's confession hung unspoken between them, a heavy, suffocating presence. He watched her, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. The city lights painted streaks of gold and crimson across her face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into her features. He saw a flicker of fear, but beneath it, a nascent spark of hope, a fragile ember against the ashes of her past. I understand, Clara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words were a concession, a tentative bridge across a chasm of hurt and distrust. She reached out, her hand covering his, a gesture of unexpected comfort. The touch sent a jolt through him, the raw, unfiltered connection stripping away years of emotional armor. He felt the warmth of her hand, the faint calluses a testament to her hard life. It was a stark contrast to the silken smoothness of his own. His carefully manicured nails suddenly felt vulgar, a symbol of the life he'd lived, a life so far removed from hers. It wasn't just the money, he whispered, his throat tight with unshed tears. It was the cruelty, the sheer, heartless cruelty of it all. He winced, the memory of his callous actions a bitter pill he had to swallow. Clara squeezed his hand. I know, she replied softly. The unspoken understanding was a balm on his wounded soul. The champagne remained untouched, but the silence between them, once heavy with unspoken accusations, now held the delicate promise of reconciliation. The city lights outside shimmered, reflecting the dawning of a new day, a new beginning, born from the ashes of a cruel past and a shocking truth. The journey would be long, arduous, yet imbued with the possibility of forgiveness and healing. The fragile hope, like the untouched champagne, waited patiently for them to uncork it. The courtroom was stifling, a suffocating blend of expensive perfume and nervous sweat. Clara, in a surprisingly elegant but simple dress, sat beside Julian's lawyer, a formidable woman with eyes that missed nothing. Julian, his usually impeccable suit slightly rumpled, sat across the room, his gaze fixed on Clara. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner. He'd finally understood the depth of his cruelty, the casual brutality he'd inflicted. The opposing lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman with a reputation for ruthlessness, launched into her closing arguments, her words a barrage designed to dismantle Julian's claim. Clara felt a familiar wave of panic rise, the chilling echo of her past homelessness threatening to overwhelm her. Julian subtly squeezed her hand under the table, a small gesture that sent a ripple of warmth through her, a silent promise of support. Miss Thorne, the judge's voice boomed, breaking the tension. Your testimony was compelling. The lawyer smirked. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. She'd spoken of the evacuation, the chaos, the separation, raw emotion, unveiled. But, the judge continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, Mr. Thorne's claim to the entire inheritance remains contested. The words hung in the air, a cruel blade slicing through the fragile hope. That night, away from the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere, Julian and Clara sat on the balcony of his penthouse apartment. The city glittered below, a breathtaking panorama of lights and shadows, mirroring the complexities of their relationship. Julian poured 2 glasses of wine, his hand trembling slightly. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For everything. Clara looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the genuine remorse, the deep-seated regret etched into his features. The years of accumulated hurt and mistrust warred within her, but beneath it, a flicker of forgiveness began to glow. I never wanted this life, he confessed, his voice breaking. I built walls around myself to protect myself, but all I did was destroy anything real. He gestured to the sprawling cityscape. It's all just hollow. Clara took a sip of wine, the smooth, rich liquid a comforting contrast to the bitter taste of her past. I know, she replied, her voice soft yet firm. But we can change that. The city lights danced in their eyes, a silent testament to the long journey ahead. A journey filled with challenges, but also with the promise of a future where forgiveness and healing could blossom from the ashes of a cruel past. The penthouse suite felt vast and echoing, a stark contrast to the cramped shelter Clara had called home. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the tempest in her soul. Julian sat opposite, his usual aloofness replaced by a hesitant vulnerability. The expensive Persian rug felt oddly cold beneath her bare feet. The lawyer said, Clara began, her voice catching. The memory of the judge's words, the contested inheritance, still stung. Julian's sigh was heavy, a sound born of weariness and regret. I messed up, terribly. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture uncharacteristically disheveled. The expensive cufflinks glinted under the soft lamplight, a poignant reminder of his former life. Clara met his gaze, searching for the sincerity she glimpsed the previous night. The city lights painted streaks of color across his face, highlighting the deep lines etched by his recent turmoil. It's not just about the money, Julian, she said quietly, her voice husky with emotion. It's about everything. He nodded, his eyes filled with a raw honesty that disarmed her. I know, and I want to make amends, truly. He reached across the polished mahogany table, his hand hovering over hers before gently laying it down. The contact was charged, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past and the uncertain future. I'm scared, Clara admitted, the confession a fragile whisper. Scared of this life, of all this wealth. Scared of you. He understood. He saw the shadows of her past etched in her cautious eyes, the lingering mistrust woven into her very being. I understand, but I promise, I won't let you down. This isn't about control anymore. It's about family. The rain intensified, the wind howling a mournful song against the glass. But inside the penthouse suite, a fragile warmth began to bloom. A hesitant hope, fragile as a newborn flower pushing through hardened earth, began to take root. The legal battle was far from over, but in that shared silence, in the unspoken promises exchanged across the polished table, a new chapter was tentatively beginning. The following morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the sheer curtains of Clara's temporary suite. It was a far cry from the grimy shadows of her previous existence, yet the opulence felt alien, cold. She sat on the plush chaise lounge, the silk cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the rough wool of the shelter blankets. The city stretched before her, a breathtaking panorama, but the beauty offered little solace. Doubt, a persistent shadow, clung to her. A soft knock on the door preceded Julian's entrance. He carried a steaming mug, the aroma of strong coffee filling the room. A simple gesture, yet profoundly different from his past behavior. He looked different. The sharp edges of his arrogance seemed softened, replaced by a hesitant gentleness. Coffee, he offered, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. He placed the mug on the small table beside her, his fingers brushing hers, a brief, almost shy touch. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The warmth of the mug radiated through her hands, a small comfort in the vast uncertainty of her new reality. Silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle hum of the city below. Julian watched her, his gaze filled with an unfamiliar vulnerability. He saw the apprehension etched on her face, the flicker of fear in her eyes. He knew she was still wary, still unsure of his motives. I know I haven't exactly covered myself in glory, he began, his voice thick with regret. And I know apologies are cheap, but... He paused, searching for the right words, his usual eloquence failing him. I'm truly sorry, Clara, for everything. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, a mixture of grief for her lost past and a hesitant hope for the future. The weight of years of hardship, of mistrust and loneliness, threatened to overwhelm her. Yet, in Julian's eyes, she saw something genuine, something that transcended his wealth and privilege. It was a flicker of remorse, of empathy, a recognition of the pain he had inflicted. "It's a lot to take in," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. The legal battle loomed, a constant reminder of the instability of her newfound situation. Yet, beneath the fear, a seed of trust began to sprout. A small, tentative hope. The rain outside had stopped. A sliver of sunshine peeked through the clouds. A new beginning, however uncertain, seemed possible. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered conversations and rustling papers. Clara, perched on the edge of her seat, felt the silk of her borrowed dress a suffocating weight against her skin. The air hung thick with anticipation, the scent of expensive perfume battling the faint, metallic tang of fear. Julian, beside her, his hand briefly resting on hers, offered a reassuring squeeze. His touch, once cold and calculating, now held a hesitant warmth. The judge's gavel fell, silencing the room. The lawyer representing Julian's estranged business partners, a shark in a tailored suit, launched into his argument, his voice a polished weapon. He spun tales of deception, of a cunning plot to usurp the Thorne fortune, painting Clara as a manipulative gold digger. Clara felt a familiar chill creep up her spine, the icy grip of distrust tightening around her heart. Julian, however, was different. His responses, sharp and precise, were laced with a quiet confidence that surprised even Clara. He didn't flinch under the lawyer's onslaught, his gaze unwavering, his voice strong yet measured. He spoke of the DNA evidence, irrefutable proof of their shared heritage, of the years of separation, and the painful truth of their past. He even acknowledged his past cruelty, his voice low with self-reproach. "My actions were inexcusable," he admitted, his words hanging heavy in the air. "But Clara is my sister, and I will fight for her right to her inheritance." During a recess, Julian found Clara in the quiet solitude of the restroom. He held her gaze, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "They're trying to tear us apart," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But they won't succeed." He gently cupped her face, his touch soft and tender. The warmth of his touch, so unlike his former icy demeanor, brought a surge of unexpected emotion. Clara leaned into his touch, her own tears threatening to spill. The years of hardship and loneliness seemed to melt away in that shared moment of vulnerability. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely a breath. "Scared of losing everything again." He pulled her closer, his embrace offering comfort and strength. "You won't," he whispered, his voice filled with a sincerity that touched her soul. He kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender it surprised them both. It was a promise, an unspoken pledge of loyalty and love, a bond forged not in blood alone, but in shared trauma and a hard-won reconciliation. The future remained uncertain, yet in that moment, hand in hand, they faced it together. The courtroom's hushed tension crackled like static electricity. Sunlight, slicing through the tall windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the turmoil in Clara's heart. The lawyer's words, sharp and accusatory, echoed in her ears, a cruel counterpoint to Julian's quiet strength. She saw the familiar flicker of his old arrogance in his eyes, but beneath it, a new resolve burned. He met her gaze across the room, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding of the battle they faced. His hand, resting briefly on hers under the table, offered a silent reassurance. It wasn't the cold, calculating touch she remembered. This time, it was a grounding presence. Later, in the sterile white of the restroom, Julian's vulnerability was raw. "They're trying to paint me as a fool, a victim of my own sister's greed," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But I won't let them." His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now filled with a weary sadness. Clara, leaning against the cool porcelain sink, felt a surge of empathy, a wave of understanding washing over her years of ingrained distrust. "They're afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of the building. "Afraid of what your money can do." He nodded, the movement slow and deliberate. And afraid of what truth will reveal. About me, about them, about us. He reached out, his hand finding hers, his touch gentle, almost hesitant. This time, it wasn't a fleeting gesture of reassurance, but a genuine connection. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "For everything." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. The years of hardship, the crushing weight of poverty, the gnawing loneliness, they all threatened to spill over. But in that shared moment of vulnerability, amidst the chaos of the trial, a fragile hope took root. The icy walls around her heart began to melt, slowly, tentatively, under the warmth of his genuine apology. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of understanding, a connection transcending the chasm of their past. He wasn't just the callous millionaire anymore. He was a man, burdened by his own mistakes, finally facing the consequences. And in his remorse, she saw a chance for healing, for both of them. The courtroom adjourned, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a fragile, shimmering reflection of Clara's own fractured hope. Outside, the city hummed, a relentless counterpoint to the quiet turmoil within her. Julian found her by the fountain in the courtyard, the water's gentle splashing a soothing balm to the day's harshness. He sat beside her, the crisp air carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. "It's not over," he said, his voice low, a stark contrast to the booming pronouncements of the courtroom. Clara looked at him, her gaze searching. His usual arrogance was replaced with a weary exhaustion. The lines etched around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and a weight he had long carried. "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But it feels like a start." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the swirling water. "They'll appeal. They always do. But this time I won't let them win." His hand brushed against hers, a brief, tentative touch that spoke volumes. It was different now, gentler, devoid of the coldness she'd grown accustomed to. A small smile played on her lips. "You've changed," she observed, her voice filled with a cautious wonder. He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Perhaps I've finally learned a thing or two. About family. About myself." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a genuine warmth she had never witnessed before. "And about the importance of apologies." She met his gaze, a flicker of the old distrust battling with a new, hesitant hope. The years of hardship had built walls around her heart, walls that were slowly, painstakingly crumbling under the weight of his remorse. I believe you," she finally whispered, the words a fragile testament to the profound change she witnessed within him. The city's relentless hum faded into the background, replaced by the quiet symphony of their unspoken reconciliation. Their shared past, once a bitter chasm, was slowly bridging. The scent of jasmine seemed to intensify, fragrant and hopeful, like the promise of a new beginning. The appeal was swift, a legal blitzkrieg designed to dismantle Clara's victory. Julian, however, was a changed man. The sharp suits and arrogant swagger were gone, replaced by a quiet determination etched onto his face. He spent hours poring over documents, his once callous fingers now tracing the faded ink of decades-old hospital records with a surprising gentleness. The scent of old paper and coffee clung to him, a stark contrast to his former cologne-drenched aura. Clara, meanwhile, found solace in a small, rented apartment overlooking a bustling park. The chirping of birds and the laughter of children were a balm to her soul, a stark difference from the echoing silence of the alleyways she'd once called home. She spent her days volunteering at a local soup kitchen, her hands moving with practiced ease as she served warm meals, the aroma of stew filling the air. A quiet strength, born from adversity, radiated from her, a stark contrast to the timid woman who had first approached Julian. One evening, Julian found her there, amidst the clatter of plates and the hushed conversations. He stood silently, observing her, a quiet pride blooming in his chest as he watched her interact with the people she served, her smile genuine and warm. The city lights twinkled outside, painting the room in a soft, warm glow. "To second chances," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Clara met his gaze, a genuine smile illuminating her face. A smile that spoke volumes of healing, acceptance, and a future reborn from the ashes of a cruel past. The clinking of their glasses was a soft echo of the new beginning that had finally dawned.